Good afternoon. I'm Carl Blumstein. I'm the director of the CITRIS I4 Energy Center. And a few announcements before I introduce our speaker. First, welcome to our web viewers and from our other campuses. On Thursday, November 6th, tomorrow, from 8:30 to 4, right here, there'll be a symposium from our enabling technologies for the next, entitled Enabling Technologies for the Next Generation of Intelligent Energy Infrastructure, which will be hosted by the Berkeley Energy and Climate Institute and the I4 Energy Center. November the 12th is the deadline for pre-proposals for this year's Big Ideas Contest. C.Y. Cynthia Lin is Associate Professor in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics and in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at UC Davis. Dr. Lin is an economist with a background in both the natural sciences and the social sciences. She uses a variety of economic and econometric methods in her research, including dynamic structural econometric models, structural econometric models of dynamic games, reduced form econometrics, spatial econometrics, dynamic programming, and optimal control theory. She is interested in a variety of issues, including those related to energy, the environment, and natural resources. She is president of the Association of Energy for Energy Economics in the Bay Area chapter, and one of 7 economists selected to serve on the California State Comptroller's Council of Economic Advisors. Cynthia?
So thank you, Carl, for the very kind introduction. And thank you to all of you for coming. It is quite an honor and delight to be here presenting at CITRIS. So as Carl mentioned, my name is Cynthia Lin. I am an associate professor in the Agricultural and Resource Economics Department and the Environmental Science and Policy Department at the University of California at Davis. I wanted to get a sense, before I begin, of who you are. So I was wondering if you could raise your hand if you're an engineer. So most of you. Raise your hand if you're an economist. Raise your hand if you're another type of natural scientist. How about, raise your hand if you're another type of social scientist. Great. And raise your hand if you're a policymaker or involved in government in some way. Great. And raise your hand if you're involved in industry in some way. Wonderful. It's great to have such a diverse audience, and thank you again to all of you for coming. So as Carl mentioned, I am an economist. I'm an economist with a background in both the natural sciences and the social sciences. And today I'll be talking to you about the economics of energy, dynamic behavior, strategic interactions, and government policy. So the question. In 1865, someone named W.S. Jevons, who is a philosopher, economist, wrote a book called The Coal Question. And in this book, The Coal Question, he posed his question, which was, would world economic activity decline from the exhaustion of coal as an energy resource? So during that period of time, the world economy was heavily dependent on using coal. Coal is a non-renewable resource, so it's finite in supply. And he was worrying at that moment, well, he was pondering whether or not, since the economy at that time was so heavily dependent on a resource, coal, that was non-renewable, would at some point world economic activity decline when we're starting to run out of coal? So that was his question that he was posing. So he wrote a book about it, and his advice was, oh, we should go ahead as an economy and burn the coal. And so his idea was, as coal becomes scarce, the economic system would respond by increasing its price. So as we're starting to run out of coal, the price of coal would increase. And when the price of coal increases, that would create incentives for people to find substitutes for coal. So they would find the price signal will be a signal that creates incentives for the economy to develop substitutes for the coal resource. So at that point in time, people are worried about economic activity potentially declining because they might run out of coal. But he said his advice was, no, the markets would take care of it. We should go ahead and burn the coal. So that was 1865. And as we know, now we still have coal. We're still using coal. But today we are faced with a similar question today in 2014. And our question today is the following. Will economic activity begin to decline as a result of two things? So now we're still heavily dependent on non-renewable resources for our energy. We're heavily dependent on fossil fuels, heavily dependent on coal, natural gas, and oil. And so, again, we might be faced with a similar question. Are we going to be worrying about depleting our energy resources and therefore causing the world economy to decline? And secondly, there's sort of a secondary concern that has been an issue now, and which is that we are depleting our ecosystem due to the byproducts of energy use, such as CO2 and SO2. So our use of these non-renewable resources is not only potentially something we might not be able to sustain into the future since they're non-renewable, but they're also causing a lot of problems to our environment. And these problems may also lead our economy to decline. So we're faced with a similar situation as the economy was faced with back in 1865. That time they were worried about running out of coal, and they didn't end up running out of coal. Right now, we're worried potentially of running out of fossil fuels, and we're potentially worried that these fossil fuels might cause a lot of environmental damage. So the question is, will the economy decline as a result of these problems, or as W.S. Jevons posited back in 1865, will the market address these problems? So is the economy going to decline, or the market? Will the market address the problems the way that W.S. Jevons said it would back in 1865? Or is the market not sufficient, and is there a role for government policy? So are markets going to solve the problem, or is there a role for government policy? So that's the question today. And just wanted to have a little straw poll. So raise your hand if you think, in general, the market can address these problems that we talk about. So if you think that the market can address these problems about these non-renewable resources and possible environmental damage. So raise your hand. OK. And then raise your hand if you think there is a role for government policy. OK. And then raise your hand if you're not sure. OK. So that's the question we're faced with in society today. So the purpose of the talk is to get you thinking about some of these issues and about whether or not markets can address some of these issues or whether or not we need government policy. And in particular, I'll talk about my research related to these questions on dynamic behavior, strategic interactions, and government policy in energy. So what do I mean by dynamic behavior? So in the energy realm, when people are making decisions, so when firms are making decisions or individuals are making decisions or countries are making decisions about energy, they take into account what they think might happen in the future when making their present decision. So for example, as individuals, when you're thinking about consumption of energy or maybe purchasing certain energy technologies or energy appliances, you think about the future, think about potentially future energy prices, the future costs of these appliances when you're making your decisions today. Likewise, when firms are making decisions about energy, whether or not they want to invest in alternative energy, where they want to invest, things like that, they are also thinking about the future when making decisions today. And then similarly, countries or policymakers, when making their decisions, they think about the future when making decisions today. So that's what I mean by dynamic behavior. So the second component are strategic interactions. So what do I mean by that? So strategic interactions arise when a decision maker makes a decision and their actions and their payoffs from these decisions depend on what other decision makers are doing. So, for example, in the context of individuals, there's strategic interactions when if I make my decisions about, for example, if I want to buy a hybrid vehicle or if I want to try out a new energy efficient technology, if my decisions depend on what other people are doing. So if my decisions about hybrid cars might depend on whether or not it's trendy, or if I think other people will like the fact that I have a hybrid car, then that's a strategic interaction. If I learn from my neighbors or my friends about how good an energy efficient technology is, that's a strategic interaction. Similarly, firms, when they're making investment decisions or decisions about production and energy, they think about what other firms are doing. And so potentially due to competition reasons or some other reasons, they behave strategically as well. And likewise, countries, when they make their decisions, they think about what other countries are doing as well. So that's what I mean by strategic interactions. And so decision makers, when they make their decisions, they behave dynamically and strategically. And when you're thinking about how to design policy, you need to take into account what you think decision makers who make strategic and dynamic decisions will do. So it's important when designing policy to account for the possible behavior of individuals or firms or countries and how they might respond to these government policies. So that's the government policy component. So my research objectives are to better understand individual and firm behavior, and in particular, sort of how they make their strategic and dynamic decisions. Secondly, I hope to better understand how different institutions and policies and changes in these institutions and policies affect this behavior and its outcome. And thirdly, I'm interested in designing institutions and policies to maximize social welfare. So knowing how individuals and firms respond to different types of policies, you can then think about how you might want to optimally design these policies. So as Carl mentioned, I use a variety of methods in my research: dynamic structural econometric models, structural econometric models of dynamic games, reduced form econometrics, spatial econometrics, dynamic programming, and optimal control theory. So to get you thinking about sort of the idea of dynamic behavior, strategic interactions, and government policy, let me start out by talking about some research I have done on offshore oil production, so offshore petroleum production. So petroleum production is a multi-stage investment timing process. So the first stage in petroleum production is exploration. So when you're a firm and you've acquired a tract of land, the first thing you want to do is to decide whether and when to invest in the drilling rigs needed for exploratory exploration of that tract of land. The second stage is development. So after a tract has been explored, so after you've done the exploratory drilling on a tract of land, you then decide whether and when to put in the production platforms needed to develop and extract the reserves. So what do these drilling rigs and production platforms look like? So here's a picture of a drilling rig offshore of Louisiana that I took back in 2004. And here is a picture of a production platform. So as these pictures demonstrate, these drilling rigs and production platforms are very large and visible structures. So it's very easy for one firm to ascertain whether another firm has begun exploration or development, respectively. For example, if one firm wants to know whether or not another firm has begun exploration and development, they can fly over the tract of land sort of leased by another firm, fly over in a helicopter, as my pilot is doing here, and see whether or not they put in a drilling rig or production platform. Alternatively, you could stand on your own production platform and then look out over the horizon to see whether or not your neighbor has put in a drilling rig and production platform. So I'm demonstrating this technique in this photo. So when firms are making their individual exploration and development timing decisions, why would one firm care about the exploration development decisions of another firm? So why would there be any strategic interactions? Well, when individual firms are making their petroleum exploration and development decisions, there are two reasons why they might behave strategically. One reason is an information externality. So when a firm owns a tract of land and it neighbors another tract of land, and these two neighboring tracts of land might share common geological resources, or they might be located over the same pool of reserve, then one firm can learn information about whether or not there's oil on their tract of land by seeing if the neighbor is drilling on their tract of land. So it's very expensive to put in a drilling rig, and the purpose of drilling, in part, is to find out if there's oil under your, in your tract of land. But you can learn information about whether or not there might be oil on your tract of land by looking and seeing the exploration and development decisions of a neighboring firm. So you wait until they do the investment first and see what arises. And so there's an information spillover, so you might behave strategically because you benefit from information from your neighbors. A second reason why there might be strategic interactions, a second reason why firms might care about the exploration and development decisions of their neighbors is an extraction externality. So when two tracts of land are located over the same pool of petroleum, then one firm has less petroleum to extract if the other firm is extracting from that same pool. So if you share a pool, one firm is extracting from that pool, that leaves less available for you to extract. So for that reason, you might behave strategically as well. So that's an extraction externality. So these are examples of strategic behavior. So there's strategic interactions, and firms are thinking dynamically when making their investment decisions. So the research questions in this project was to figure out, first, do firms interact strategically? And secondly, whether or not the externalities have any net strategic effect that may cause petroleum production to be inefficient. And so the results of this research, I find that the importance of strategic interactions depend on tract size. And in particular, the externalities do not have any net non-cooperative strategic effect on large tracts. So the intuition behind this is the following. So if you have small tracts of land, then it's more likely that you and your neighboring tract of land, so you and your neighbor, and if the neighboring tract of land is owned by a different firm, it's more likely when you have small tracts that these two tracts are located over the same pool of oil, or that they share common geological characteristics. On the other hand, if the tracts are much larger, then it might be possible that you internalize all the externality, meaning that your tract of land is large enough that you're no longer sharing the same pool as your neighbor, and you're no longer sharing the same geological characteristics as your neighbor. So with a larger tract size, it's less likely that there's these strategic behaviors going on that may lead petroleum production to be inefficient. And in terms of the role of policy, so these tracts of land that I looked at were tracts of land offshore in the Gulf of Mexico, and they were offshore federal lands. And so the federal government leases these tracts of land to petroleum-producing firms who are interested in producing petroleum. So one policy parameter that the federal government has is the size of the tract of land. So that's sort of how government policy can influence strategic and dynamic decision-making, because by determining the tract of land, it essentially determines the extent to which firms are behaving strategically with one another, the extent to which they're playing timing games where they're waiting for another firm to explore first before they explore, things like that. That's the size of the tract of land is important policy parameter that the government has control over. And according to my results, since the larger tracts in my sample don't have the strategic behavior, and in fact, most of the tracts in my sample are of the larger size, I find that the government's choice of tract size has minimized additional efficiencies that may have resulted from non-cooperative strategic interactions. So in this case, I find that the federal government's choice of tract size for most of its tracts are actually large enough that these strategic interactions, which would otherwise arise when the tracts are smaller, are not that much of a problem. So here is an example of strategic and dynamic behavior and how government policy can influence the outcome of this behavior. So next, to talk a little bit more about government policy and how it influences behavior, I'll talk about a second project that I've been working on wind turbine shutdowns and upgrades. And so this is a project that I've been working on with my former PhD student, Jonathan Cook. So renewable energy policy is motivated by a variety of concerns. So it's motivated by concerns about climate change, about fossil fuel price volatility, about possible fossil fuel scarcity, and about energy security. So all these are important concerns, and they have, because of these concerns, many countries have instituted different forms of renewable energy policy. Some people argue that renewable energy policy is needed for nascent industries to be competitive with our conventional fossil fuel sources of energy. And for many countries, wind energy is the leading option in terms of renewable energy policy. So an important question for policy is, how do government policies affect decisions regarding the scrapping or upgrading of existing assets? So the assets in energy industries are very important, and government policies can affect how these assets are managed. And in particular, we wonder how much of the shutdowns and upgrades of existing assets can be attributed to the policies as opposed to other market trends. So how are policies causing assets to be shut down and upgraded, or are market trends the ones that are causing the assets to be shut down and upgraded? And how do policies affect the timing of owner decisions and the subsequent path of the industry? So we're looking in particular at the wind industry, and so the assets here are wind turbines. And so we're wondering how government policies regarding the wind industry affect decisions of turbine owners of whether or not to scrap their wind turbine or whether or not to upgrade their turbine. And we're wondering if it's mostly policy that's driving their decisions, or are they being driven by market trends? So if you think about the question I posed at the beginning of the talk, is it really the market which is driving what's happening in the energy industry? And does the market enable us to solve our problems, or is it more government policy? So that's what we're wondering. And we're wondering how government policies affect the timing of decisions of wind turbine owners and how it affects the subsequent path of the wind industry. So these questions about how government policies affect assets in the wind industry, these questions will become increasingly relevant in the near future as existing wind turbines approach the end of their expected lifetimes, and also as technology continues to improve. So the objectives of the research are the following. First, we want to model wind turbines owners' dynamic decisions. So they're making decisions about whether or not to add a turbine to their stock of turbines, whether or not to scrap one of their turbines, or whether or not to upgrade their turbines. And so we want to model how they're making these decisions. We want to estimate the underlying profit structure for wind producers. So we want to estimate what factors affect the payoffs for wind producers. And we also want to evaluate the impact of technology and government policy. So we're trying to evaluate whether or not technological improvements are driving their decisions or whether or not it's government policy. So the method we use is to estimate a dynamic structural econometric model. So it's a dynamic model of wind turbine owners' decisions to add, scrap, and upgrade the turbines. This model takes into account the dynamics and interdependence of shutdown and upgrade decisions. So these decisions are dynamic decisions. So when you're thinking about adding a turbine, you're thinking about the future and whether or not we'd rather add the turbine later or wait, or should we add it now? So we're thinking about the future. Similarly, if you want to scrap their turbine, you're thinking about potentially waiting to do it or doing it now. So the future is very important. Moreover, these decisions are interdependent. So let's say we added a turbine. Once we add a turbine, we then have another turbine for which we then make decisions about whether or not to scrap or upgrade that turbine. Similarly, if we have, for example, two turbines and we shut down one of the turbines, then we're back in the world of having just one turbine for which we want to decide whether or not to add a turbine, scrap, or upgrade. So these decisions are all very interdependent. Our model enables us to generate parameter estimates with direct economic interpretations. In particular, we're estimating parameters in the wind turbine owners' payoff functions, so we know how different factors affect their payoffs to making different decisions. And we use our parameter estimates to simulate counterfactual policy scenarios. So with these parameters, we can simulate what sort of welfare turbine owners would get under different types of policies. So why do we want to use a dynamic model? So I was talking about how dynamic behavior is important. There are several reasons. First, the decisions to add and scrap and upgrade your turbine are decisions of investments under uncertainty. So these decisions are partially irreversible, so it costs a lot, for example, to add a turbine or upgrade your turbine. There's uncertainty over the future rewards for making that investment, so it's uncertain how much you'll exactly get in terms of payoff for making these decisions. And turbine owners have leeway over the timing of the investment. So they don't necessarily have to add the turbine today. They might want to wait until they learn more information and potentially add the turbine next year instead of today. So there's an option value to waiting. And as a consequence, it's best for turbine owners to think dynamically rather than just in a myopic one-period decision-making model. A second reason to use a dynamic model is, as I mentioned, the scrapping and adding and upgrading decisions are interdependent decisions, and so a dynamic model would be the best type of model to incorporate this feature. So the policy context, so we're looking at the wind industry in Denmark. Denmark has a strong history of developing wind power since the 1970s. It was initially motivated by energy security concerns in the oil crisis in the 1970s, and later it was also motivated by environmental concerns. Denmark has ambitious energy goals for 2050, and it hopes that by 2050, 50% of its electricity generation will come from wind. It currently has approximately 24% of its electricity generation from wind. And the government has been very involved in guiding wind development. So in particular, it has instituted two primary policies to promote wind development, a Feedin Tariff and a replacement certificate program. So I'll talk about each of these. So the Feedin Tariff is a supplement to the electricity production price, and it's paid to wind turbine owners. And the level of the feed-in tariff is determined by the date a turbine was built. So when you build a turbine, you're locked into a particular level of the feed-in tariff, and you get this additional amount of money when you sell electricity. This is in part because your feed-in tariff is locked in at the date when it's built. It's in part why a dynamic model is important, because you want to think about whether or not you want to build your turbine now or later, because once you build it, your feed-in tariff is locked in at that date. The other type of policy that Danish government has implemented is a replacement certificate program. So this is a certificate given to turbine owners who scrap their turbines. And the certificate grants an additional price supplement for a new turbine that is constructed. So the government, in part, is hoping to incentivize turnover of older, smaller turbines to newer, better technology turbines. And the way they're hoping to do this is by giving people a certificate if you scrap your turbine and build another one in its place. So those are the two policies, the feed-in tariff and the replacement certificate program. So those are our measures of government policy. We want to contrast that with technology. So there could be different things that influence wind turbines owners' decisions to add, scrap, and upgrade their turbines. They could be motivated by policy, or they could be motivated by something in the market. And in particular, we're focusing on technology and the state of wind turbine technology. So it could be that technologies and improvements in technology are driving their decisions more so than government policy. And our measure of wind turbine, the state of wind turbine technology, what we use in our model is the levelized cost of energy. The levelized cost of energy is the total present value cost of a turbine divided by the total amount of electricity it produces in its lifetime. So it's essentially the price that electricity would have to be sold at in order for a new generator to break even over its lifetime. So that's the concept of levelized cost. So the idea is that as the wind turbine technology improves, the cost of the turbine will decline, and at the same time, the capacity factors of these turbines will increase. Both will lead to lower levelized cost of energy. So our indicator of technology is the levelized cost of energy. As technology improves, this levelized cost will decline. So the results that I'm finding or that we're finding, is that the growth and development of the Danish wind industry is primarily driven by government policies, not technological improvement. So it's really those the feed-in tariffs and the replacement certificate program that are driving the decisions of Danish wind turbine owners much more so than improvements in technology that decrease the levelized cost of energy. Secondly, we're finding that the government policies impacted the timing of shutdown and upgrade decisions. So the government policies really impacted when the turbines were shut down and when they were upgraded. And then the government policies accelerated the development of the wind industry in Denmark. So because of these policies, the wind industry really accelerated. There's many more turbines that were built and also upgraded than would have occurred in the absence of the policy. So we were using our model to simulate several alternative policies to compare with the current state of policy in Denmark. So currently there's a feed-in tariff and a replacement certificate. We use our model to simulate what happens, for example, if there's no feed-in tariff. What happens, and in another scenario, we simulate what if there's no replacement certificate. We also try what if they have a feed-in tariff but it declines over time. And then we also tried what if there's neither a feed-in tariff nor a replacement certificate. And we find that in the absence of the policy, there would have been much less development in the wind industry than there was as a result of the policy. So the policies were really important in driving the wind industry. So we're finding here that government policy may be important. So in the wind industry in Denmark, a renewable energy industry where it's maybe difficult for a renewable energy industry to compete cost competitively with conventional sources of energy. In these types of industries, government policies may be important, and if it weren't for these government policies, technology or the market alone would not be driving the development of these industries. So that's sort of one thing that our research on the wind industry seems to suggest. However, even though government policy is important, the design of government policy matters a lot. So I'll talk about some research I've done, sort of shedding light on the idea that the design of government policies matters. So it's not only, although government policy might be important, especially for renewable fuels and renewable energy, it's important to design these policies carefully. So in the realm of ethanol policy, so my former PhD students and postdocs, Fujin Yi and Karen Tomey and I, have developed a model to evaluate the effects of government subsidies and the renewable fuel standard on the fuel ethanol industry. So we developed a dynamic games model. So we're modeling players in the ethanol industry, so firms in the ethanol industry, using, we're modeling their dynamic and strategic decisions. So we're modeling them as a dynamic game. They're making their decisions about production, how much ethanol to produce, how much capacity to invest in, whether to enter the industry, whether to exit. So all these are decisions in our model. And we're trying to see the effects of the renewable fuel standard as well as government policies on their decisions. And we use our model to simulate alternative policies. So the current policies that are in place in the ethanol industry include the renewable fuel standard. Previously, there has also been a production subsidy for ethanol. So when you produce ethanol, you get a subsidy. However, we wanted to see whether or not other forms of subsidies might be better. And so we tried also simulating the effects of an investment subsidy, where you get a subsidy every time you invest in capacity in ethanol. We also tried an entry subsidy, where you get a subsidy if you enter the ethanol market. And we find that the design of policy really matters. Whereas the federal government has tried production subsidies in the past, they're actually not the most effective nor the most cost-effective type of subsidy. If you want to incentivize the development of the ethanol industry, you want to increase capacity investment, you want to increase production in the ethanol industry, investment subsidies and entry subsidies are more effective than production subsidies. So it's you can't. If you want to implement policy, you can't just implement any policy. You want to think about what's the most effective and cost-effective types of policies. And it turns out that in the ethanol industry, if you target investment with a subsidy, you target entry with a subsidy, those are more effective than production subsidies. And moreover, they're more cost effective. So for the same amount of money, you could do a lot more incentivizing the ethanol fuel industry using investment subsidies and entry subsidies rather than production subsidies. In another project that I'm pursuing with my PhD student Gabriel Lade, we're finding that if you have mandates, so in the renewable fuel industry, a lot of the government policies in place to incentivize development of the renewable fuel industry are forms of mandates. So mandates are where they you specify a certain amount of ethanol, for example, needs to be produced. And often with these types of policies, the government specifies a certain amount of ethanol that we want to achieve, and then you can trade compliance credits. And it turns out that with these types of policies, if you have a mandate with compliance credits, there's a concern that the cost of compliance will increase a lot. So especially when the mandates become more stringent and becomes much more costly to achieve these compliance, and we find that it's best to combine these mandates with a hard cap on credit prices to contain compliance costs. So if you're designing a mandate, so examples of these mandates are California's low carbon fuel standard, as well as the US federal government's renewable fuel standard. These both are mandates that have compliance credits associated with them. These credit prices have, there's a concern that their credit prices might increase a lot in the future as these policies become more stringent and harder to comply with. If you want these policies to be effective, we find that it's best to combine the mandate with this credit trading program with a hard cap on credit prices. So that's another example of where the design of policy really matters. Another issue regarding the design of policy is something called the rebound effect. So one possible way to reduce natural resource consumption is to increase the efficiency with which individuals and firms use natural resources. So you would think that if you increase the efficiency with which we use natural resources, it might reduce consumption. However, when technology enables people to use natural resources more efficiently, they end up using more of it. So it could be the case that if I can use something more efficiently, instead of reducing my consumption of it, I might actually use more of the resource. And as a result of the rebound effect, natural resource conservation policies may be ineffective or even have perverse consequences. So this is sort of a possible perverse consequence of policies. So to give you an idea of the rebound effect, so in previous work with my former PhD student Lisa Pfeiffer, we've evaluated the rebound effect in water policy. And what we see is that there have been a lot of programs that have been instituted to subsidize efficient irrigation technology. So they hope that in subsidizing a technology that enables farmers to irrigate more efficiently, the hope is that they reduce their use of water and irrigation to irrigate their crops. But we find that these programs actually cause farmers to respond by switching to more water-intensive crops, thereby increasing, not decreasing, water extraction. So there's possible perverse consequences of policies that try to encourage conservation of natural resources by giving you some technology to use that resource more efficiently. If you get that technology, it could be the case that individuals or firms or households respond not by decreasing that consumption, but actually using more of the resource. So this project that was also cited in the New York Times is something in the realm of water policy, but you can think of the same rebound effect potentially happening in energy policy. So if you give more energy efficient technology, more energy efficient appliances, it might be the case that people don't actually reduce the energy consumption, but actually increase it instead. And so here's an example where understanding behavior and the decision making of individuals and firms are important if you want to design policy well. Okay, so let me return back to the question I posed at the beginning. So if you recall, we had the issue today that we're facing, which is, will economic activity begin to decline as a result of the exhaustion of depletable energy resources and of the depletion of our ecosystem due to byproducts of energy use such as CO2 and SO2? Or will the market address these problems, and is there a role for government policy? So let me ask again. So first of all, how many people think that the market is actually more important than they thought at the beginning of this talk? No one. How many people think that the government is actually, the role for government is actually even more important than they thought at the beginning of the clock? And how many people think that the issue is more complicated than they thought at the beginning of the clock? So in conclusion, sort of some takeaways for some of the different research projects that I've been working on is that there may be a role for government energy policy, particularly for renewable energy and renewable fuels. So there, especially for these sort of nascent industries of where right now the costs of production are really high, there may be a role for a government energy policy. However, government policy must be designed carefully, and in particular, it's important for when designing policy to think of possible behavioral responses and maybe some possible perverse consequences of your policy when you're designing government policy. So thank you for coming, and I'm open to any questions you may have.
Hi.
Hi.
Could you speak for a moment about the variables in the models, about the independent variables? So am I right in surmising from your talk that feed-in tariffs were highly significant, seems to make sense, and that things like the production tax credit were not?
So thank you for the question. So for example, in the wind industry, so the model is a model of decision making of the firms. So what we're doing is where firms are making choices. So it's not a simple regression where there's an independent variable and dependent variables. There's the turbine owners are making decisions each period about whether or not to add a turbine or scrap a turbine or not do anything or upgrade their turbine. And they're making these decisions to maximize their payoffs. And so the parameters in our model are parameters in their payoff function. And so we're figuring out what these parameters must have been in order for them to make the choices that they made. And we find, for example, just as you say, that the feed-in tariff is very significant, as well as the replacement certificate program. We find that the technology, the levelized cost of energy is statistically significant. So all those parameters are statistically significant. But in terms of the magnitudes and what they mean in terms of what decisions are made, the government policies tend to be the more important ones. Yes?
Can you comment on whether pricing and taxation can counteract the rebound effect?
That's a good question. So oftentimes a good policy, so generally economists like to think that market-based instruments are good policies. So market-based instruments include, for example, taxes on carbon taxes, for example, or you could have a cap and trade program, which is another market-based instrument. The nice thing about these market-based instruments is that they put a price on something that we want to maybe disincentivize the use of. And so with a carbon tax, that would be actually, if you wanted to incentivize or you wanted to decrease emissions of carbon, a carbon tax is probably one of the better instruments to use. The rebound effect often arises when you do things like either mandate a certain efficient technology or some other things like that, and those are where the rebound effects end up happening. So if you actually put a price on carbon, if you wanted to increase your energy consumption, you'd pay more because of this tax. And for that reason, that is a nice price signal that would in part counteract the rebound effects.
Hi, this is a kind of related question, but also more molar in some respects. There was a conference here a while back after which a Norwegian energy executive said that the Earth currently subsidizes fossil fuel something to the tune of like $1 trillion per year, and that we could basically convert the entire planet to solar power even for that amount per year. And wind energy is, as I understand it, even cheaper. Do you have a sense of whether or not those estimates are in the ballpark?
That's an excellent question. So unfortunately, I can't say sort of how much money is needed in order to convert the planet, for example, from fossil fuels all the way to entirely renewable energy. It is something that would cost. It's not something I'm guessing the amount of money to do that would be a lot if you want to do it immediately. I think the best way to do it is for the government to incentivize research and development in these technologies, and the hope is that eventually the market can take over. So I know many of you weren't market believers, but in general, it's better for the market to be the ones that are causing price signals for investments to occur. With these renewable fuels and renewable energy, you may need government involvement, especially in the beginning, to get the market going. But I don't think we want to be thinking of the government sort of getting involved in wholesale converting the whole economy to renewable fuels. That would be really expensive.
I'm interested in your comment at the end about the rebound effect and what crop the farmers switched to that was not profit maximizing under the old inefficient water use regime, but we'll assume became more profitable after water became less expensive. And what the implications are in terms of human behavior, because mostly people talk about the rebound effect in terms of not firms, I mean they talk about firms as well, but more consumer behavior in terms of people switching from one form of technology use in energy using technology in their home to another. And in that latter case, how to separate the effects that people are buying bigger televisions anyway, or no matter what is probably a better way to say it, no matter what. But I am interested, did they switch to rice? Is that what they switched to?
They switched to more water-intensive crops. So what happened was that initially it was just more costly for them to be planting some of these more water-intensive crops, and because of the irrigation technology, they switched to more water-intensive crops. And in terms of the so crops like rice and crops like alfalfa and stuff that were a little more water-intensive. In terms of technologies in the household, so it is a tricky question to actually tease out the rebound effect. So you're exactly right there. Some of these decisions might have been made regardless of government programs to subsidize efficient technology. So it is a sort of active area of research for people to figure out whether or not there actually is a rebound effect. But in theory, it is something that we want to be aware of when designing policy.
All right, I think we don't have any more questions. Thank you very much, Cynthia.